At 0700 on January 24, 1945, the world was a frozen wasteland of white and gray. First Lieutenant Garland Merle Connor stood in the command post of the 3rd Battalion. He watched through the haze as German artillery began to methodically erase the tree line. The intelligence officer was only 25, but the war had already aged him a lifetime. Connor had recently returned from a hospital bed with wounds that were still red and angry. He was a small man, standing 5'6" and weighing a meager 120 pounds. Before the war, he was just a tobacco farmer from the rugged hills of Clinton County, Kentucky. He had never finished high school because the nearest classroom was 15 miles from his home. The German 19th Army was not merely probing. They were launching a massive, desperate strike. 600 elite infantrymen were supported by 6 Mark VI Tiger tanks, the kings of the battlefield. Their objective was to shatter the American lines near the town of Hausen, located in France. If they broke through here, the entire sector of the 7th Army would be in grave peril. Connor was a veteran of the most brutal campaigns the European theater had to offer. He had enlisted in March 1941, long before the smoke had cleared from Pearl Harbor's ruins. In 4 years, he had survived 10 major campaigns and 4 separate amphibious assault landings. He had been wounded 7 times, yet he always found his way back to the front lines. The 3rd Battalion held a jagged section of the front line north of the infamous Colmar Pocket. The pocket was the last vestige of German-held territory west of the mighty Rhine River. It spanned 850 square miles of frozen forests and farm fields that swallowed men whole. Every previous Allied attempt to eliminate this stubborn German stronghold had ended in failure. The French First Army had already sacrificed thousands of men against these entrenched positions. The German offensive known as Operation Nordwind had started with the new year of 1945. Hitler had ordered Army Group G to break the American spirit in the region of Alsace. While the Battle of the Bulge raged to the north, this southern front was equally lethal. The soldiers of the 3rd Battalion had been clinging to the line for 18 grueling days. Temperatures plummeted to 10 degrees below zero, freezing the lubricant in their weapons. There was no moonlight to guide them, only the ghostly reflection of the snow-covered earth. The men slept in frozen foxholes, their bodies shaking with a cold that never truly left. German patrols were like shadows, probing the American positions under the cover of every night. The battalion had lost 43 men in just 2 weeks to the constant harassment. Sniper fire and sudden artillery bursts were the primary architects of their mounting casualties. Fear was a constant companion, whispered in the whistling sound of incoming mortar shells. Connor's official job was that of an intelligence officer, a role usually removed from direct fire. He gathered information, interrogated shivering prisoners, and analyzed frantic patrol reports. He spent his days marking German positions on paper maps with red and blue grease pencils. It was a role designed for the rear, for men who worked with data rather than bayonets. Intelligence officers were supposed to stay behind the front lines where the maps were dry. They were not trained to lead infantry charges or stand in the path of oncoming armor. But Connor was a man who defined himself by the mud on his boots and the men he served. For years of war had taught him that a map is useless if the man holding it is a coward. His reputation in the 3rd Battalion was built on a foundation of incredible, quiet courage. He had earned 4 Silver Stars for direct combat action across Italy and the fields of France. October 1943 in Italy, January 1944 at Anzio, and September 1944 in French soil. Each medal told a story of a moment where Connor chose the lives of others over his own safety. When the situation turned desperate, the men of the battalion looked for the small Kentuckian. They knew that Connor didn't hide in bunkers when the ground began to shake from explosions. He had a magnetic pull toward the danger, always moving forward when others sought cover. At 0715, the situation transitioned from merely dangerous to a struggle for absolute survival. The German artillery barrage intensified. the shells walking toward the battalion's forward positions. Trees didn't just fall. They exploded into thousands of jagged wooden daggers. Frozen earth fountained into the air, creating a dark curtain against the white morning sky. The barrage lasted for 12 minutes, a lifetime for those huddled in the shallow trenches. Then a sudden and terrifying silence fell over the woods, heavier than the noise before it. The silence was broken by the low, guttural growl of heavy Maybach tank engines. A runner burst into the command post, his breath coming in frantic white gasps of panic. Germans advancing. 6 Tigers. Hundreds of infantry moving toward our left flank, he cried. The battalion commander hovered over the map, his face pale in the dim light of the bunker. If the Tigers reached the American foxholes, they would roll over them like heavy steamrollers. The battalion would be overrun, and the retreat would likely turn into a bloody massacre. There were no American tanks or tank destroyers in position to stop the steel monsters. The only weapon in the American arsenal that could halt 6 Tiger tanks was the heavy artillery. But artillery is a blind giant. It needs eyes to see where the shells are falling. A forward observer was required to watch the Germans and adjust the fire with precision. However, the forward observation post had been completely destroyed during the initial barrage. The previous observers were either dead or severely wounded, lying silent in the red snow. From the command post, the view was obstructed by the dense, snow-laden thickets of trees. No one could see the German advance, and the artillery remained silent and useless. Connor looked at the map. Then he looked at the tree line 400 yards away across the open field. He knew that to see the attack, someone would have to run across that killing field. It would have to survive the artillery and stay ahead of the American line as the enemy closed in. 6 Tiger tanks and 600 infantrymen were moving directly toward that specific piece of ground. It was a suicide mission, a task that required a man to walk into the open arms of death. Connor did not wait for an order, nor did he ask for permission to risk his life once more. He reached out and picked up a field telephone and a heavy spool containing 400 yards of wire. He shared a brief, silent look with the battalion commander that conveyed everything needed. Then he stepped out of the command post and into the biting wind of the French winter. The German artillery had paused, but Connor knew the respite was only a temporary illusion. The Germans were masters of the coordinated attack, waiting for their infantry to close the gap. They would open fire again to pin the Americans down, while the Tigers led the final assault. Connor began to run, his boots crunching through the icy crust of the deep white snow. There were 400 yards of completely open ground between the command post and the front line. The telephone wire unspooled behind him, like a thin black lifeline trailing in the snow. He carried the heavy spool in his left hand and the telephone hand set firmly in his right. With every step, he broke through the frozen crust, slowing his progress across the field. When he reached the 100-yard mark, the German gunners spotted the lone moving figure. The guns opened fire again, the shells landing 40 yards to his left with a deafening roar. The Germans were adjusting their aim, their observers watching the lone American from the ridge. They could not believe a single soldier was challenging their massive, coordinated advance. A shell hit a massive tree 70 yards ahead of him, and the trunk vanished in a splintered flash. Hot metal and frozen wood fragments showered down like a lethal rain across the clearing. Connor kept running, his heart hammering against his ribs as he focused on the distant line. Another shell landed 20 yards behind him, the shockwave hitting him like a physical fist. He stumbled from the force of the blast, his lungs burning from the sub-zero temperature. The wire kept unspooling, the only connection between the infantry and the salvation of the big guns. At 250 yards, a shell destroyed another tree directly in his path, splitting the trunk in half. The massive timber crashed into the snow, but Connor vaulted over it without losing his stride. Pieces of hot metal hissed as they landed in the snow, turning the white powder to steam. Another shell landed only 15 yards to his left, sending a geyser of frozen dirt into the sky. The blast wave hammered his eardrums until he could no longer hear his own ragged breathing. A high-pitched ringing took over his senses, but his legs continued their mechanical rhythm forward. He reached the American front line at 300 yards, gasping for air that felt like liquid ice. The soldiers crouched in their foxholes stared at him with wide, disbelieving eyes. They saw an intelligence officer running toward certain death with nothing but a telephone. He did not stop to explain his madness. He simply kept running forward, beyond the foxholes. 30 yards beyond the furthest American position, Connor found a shallow, frozen ditch. It was only 18 inches deep, offering no real protection against bullets or heavy shells. But it was deep enough to hide his silhouette from the Germans while he watched them. He dropped into the mud and ice, his fingers fumbling to crank the telephone's handset. The connection buzzed to life, and a voice answered from the Fire Direction Center miles away. 12 105mm howitzers were waiting for his command to unleash their terrible power. Connor gave his exact coordinates, his voice steady, despite the chaos unfolding around him. He was now the eyes of the 3rd Battalion, and the fate of every man rested on his shoulders. He raised his head above the rim of the ditch and saw the German infantry 200 yards away. They were moving through the trees in disciplined squad formations, rifles held at the ready. They advanced in short, professional rushes, using covering fire to protect their movements. These were not green recruits. They were experienced soldiers who knew how to kill. Behind the wall of infantry came the Tigers. 6 massive 60-ton monsters of steel and fire. They pushed through the smaller trees as if they were nothing more than fragile saplings. They used the forest for cover, moving with a slow, methodical pace that signaled inevitable doom. In minutes, they would break into the open ground and begin the slaughter of the Americans. The Germans had not yet spotted the small man hidden in the shallow ditch ahead of the line. He was completely alone, 30 yards ahead of his comrades, with 600 enemies walking toward him. Connor lifted the handset, his eyes locked on the leading edge of the German formation. "Fire mission," he whispered. "Enemy infantry in the open. 600 meters. Adjusting." He knew the first shells would take 40 seconds to arrive from the batteries in the rear. If the Germans spotted him before then, they would kill him before he could adjust the fire. If the shells landed too close to his ditch, he would be killed by his own artillery. If they landed too far, the Tigers would simply roll over him and destroy the battalion. Connor watched the Germans and began to count the seconds in his head as the world held its breath. 38, 39, 40. The sky above him suddenly began to scream. 12 shells hit the tree line 150 yards behind the advancing German infantry. "Too far," Connor muttered, grabbing the handset. "Drop 100. Fire for effect." The German infantry continued their advance, ignoring the shells landing far behind them. They assumed the American gunners were merely guessing and that they had time to reach the line. But Connor was not guessing. He was watching every movement with cold, lethal precision. The second salvo arrived 18 seconds later, and this time the world disintegrated. The forest erupted in a hellish display of high explosives and shredded timber. 12 shells carrying 168 pounds of explosive detonated in the middle of the German formation. Soldiers simply disappeared in the flashes, while others were thrown like ragdolls into the snow. The advance stopped instantly as the survivors scrambled for any cover they could find. Connor cranked the handset again, his face illuminated by the distant flashes of the impacts. "Repeat fire." "Same coordinates," he commanded, his voice a low growl over the phone. The American guns were now firing at their maximum rate, 4 rounds per minute for every gun. 48 shells every 60 seconds were hammering the same small patch of frozen forest. The German squad formations broke apart as the men scattered like leaves in a storm. The forest had become a killing ground where no amount of training could save them. But through the smoke and fire, the 6 Tiger tanks continued their relentless forward crawl. The 105mm shells were not powerful enough to penetrate the thick armor of the steel beasts. The Tigers advanced in a wedge formation, their long 88mm guns searching for targets. Tank commanders stood in the turrets, scanning the American line for any sign of resistance. One Tiger fired, the muzzle blast clearing a circle of snow around the massive tank. The shell hit an American foxhole 300 yards to Connor's right, obliterating everything inside. Another Tiger fired, and another American position vanished in a fountain of dirt and snow. The tanks were now 300 yards from the foxholes, only minutes away from a total breakthrough. If they crossed the defensive line, the 3rd Battalion would collapse into a panicked retreat. The Germans would pursue them through the woods, slaughtering the men as they ran. Connor shifted his fire mission, focusing the power of the artillery on the armored threat. Enemy armor advancing, 250 meters. Adjust fire onto the tanks, he signaled. Precision was the problem. Artillery was an area effect weapon, not a sniper's rifle. Tanks were small, moving targets that required a direct hit to be truly neutralized. Shells began to fall around the Tigers, but the tanks drove through the blasts unmoved. Their commanders knew the American 105s were mostly a nuisance to their heavy plating. They intended to drive straight through the barrage and into the heart of the American defense. Connor knew he needed the shells closer, much closer, to stand any chance of stopping them. "Drop 50, fire for effect," he shouted into the telephone as the ground shook beneath him. The next salvo landed among the Tigers, and a shell struck the lead tank's right track. The heavy metal link snapped, and the Tiger slewed hard to the right, immobilized in the mud. It was stuck, but its turret still traversed, its 88mm guns still searching for souls to take. Another Tiger took a direct hit on the engine deck, and thick black smoke began to billow out. The crew might fighting from their stationary fortress, or they might choose to abandon the steel trap. 4 Tigers were still moving, and they had adjusted their course directly toward the ditch. They had spotted the flashes of the telephone wire and the man directing the fire. They were coming to kill him, and Connor checked the shallow rim of his 18-inch cover. It was not enough to stop an 88mm shell or the sustained fire of a German machine gun. The Germans were now 150 yards away, close enough for Connor to see the tank commanders' faces. He lifted the handset one more time, making a decision that defied the instinct of survival. "Fire on my position," he said clearly, his voice echoing in the small fire direction center. The officer on the other end hesitated, asking Connor to repeat the suicidal request. Calling artillery on one's own position meant the shells would land within yards of the observer. Connor confirmed a 3rd time, knowing he was essentially signing his own death warrant. 40 seconds later, the first American shells landed only 30 yards in front of his ditch. The concussion wave felt like being hit by a speeding truck, compressing the air in his lungs. His vision blurred, and frozen dirt rained down on him as the world turned into a roar. He stayed pressed to the mud, the handset still clutched tightly against his ear. "Drop Archer. Repeat fire." He screamed into the phone as the heat from the blasts reached him. The next salvo landed 20 yards out, the shrapnel tearing the air just feet above his head. If he had stood up, he would have been shredded into nothingness by his own guns. The Tigers stopped their advance, the commanders forced to button up their hatches against the fire. Even a Tiger crew feared point-blank artillery fire that could shatter their optics or tracks. But the German infantry was rallying, using the massive tanks as mobile steel fortresses. They were moving when the tanks moved, staying in the shadows of the heavy armor. Connor adjusted his fire, walking the shells back and forth across the German line of advance. One Tiger took a direct hit on the turret, damaging the ring so it could no longer turn. It was now useless for anything other than firing straight ahead at the empty forest. Another tiger lost its track to a lucky hit, and the crew scrambled out of the hatches to flee. American machine gunners in the foxholes cut them down before they could reach the trees. 3 tigers remained operational, and the German infantry was closing the distance to 100 yards. Connor could see their individual faces now, distorted by the cold and the fury of the battle. They were crawling through the snow, using shell craters as temporary cover between rushes. They were trying to flank the ditch, to cut the telephone wire and silence the American guns. Connor had been lying in the frozen mud for 40 minutes, and his limbs were losing feeling. Frozen dirt was in his eyes and mouth, and the telephone was slippery with a coating of ice. A shell landed 15 yards to his right, and another landed 15 yards to his left. The German artillery observers had finally pinpointed him and were trying to kill him. The ditch had become the center of a terrible storm where 2 different armies were firing. The soldiers in the 3rd Battalion watched the lone lieutenant who refused to retreat. They saw him lying in the middle of a literal inferno, adjusting fire and killing Germans. He was a stationary target in a world of moving steel, yet he remained the master of the field. The German infantry pushed forward again, now only 80 yards from the shallow ditch. Connor could hear the officers shouting commands over the roar of the near-constant explosions. He dropped the artillery another 10 yards, the shells landing 60 yards from his position. The blast waves hammered him into the earth, and dirt cascaded into his narrow sanctuary. Something hit his left shoulder with a sharp, heavy force that made his entire arm go numb. He didn't know if it was shrapnel or a rock, but he switched the handset to his right hand. The Germans stopped again, realizing that the American observer was dangerously close. They knew that if they could kill this one man, nothing could stop their final breakthrough. The 3 remaining tigers spread out, leaving 50 yards between each tank for safety. They were 200 yards from the American foxholes, their machine guns raking the tree line. Connor called fire on the leftmost tank, then the center, then the right, in rapid succession. He was splitting the battery's power, trying to slow the entire line down at once. One shell hit the center tiger's front plate, rocking the 60-ton machine backward with force. The driver lost control for a second, and the tank jammed its track on a frozen stump. Now only 2 tigers were moving, and the German infantry was inside the 50-yard mark. Connor could see a young German officer signaling his men forward with silent hand gestures. 20 German soldiers were following the officer, crawling in a skirmish line toward the ditch. They intended to overwhelm the position from multiple angles before the artillery could react. Connor cranked the handset and gave the most dangerous coordinates of the entire morning. "Drop 5. Fire for effect," he yelled, calling the shells to the very edge of his hole. The shells landed 25 yards away, and the German officer disappeared in a red flash. The survivors pressed themselves into the snow, waiting for the barrage to lift. But it didn't. Connor kept the shells falling, creating a literal wall of fire between himself and the enemy. Hot metal fragments embedded themselves into the frozen earth inches from his reaching hand. The 2 remaining tigers were now 150 yards from the foxholes, their machine guns blazing. The bullets chewed through the trees and logs, pinning the American defenders in their holes. The Gias returned fire with rifles, but the bullet simply sparked off the tiger's thick skin. They tried to hit the vision ports to blind the drivers, but the tanks kept rolling forward. Connor called for smoke shells mixed with high explosives to blind the oncoming armor. White phosphorus smoke billowed up, thick and choking, hiding the world from view. He could no longer see the tanks, but he could hear the grinding of their massive tracks. The smoke made them invisible, but it didn't stop their slow, methodical progress toward the line. A tiger emerged from the white smoke only 70 yards from the American defensive line. Its 88 millimeters gun fired, and a machine gun position vanished in a cloud of debris and death. Connor called fire directly onto the tank's coordinates, knowing he was in the kill zone. The fire direction officer hesitated again, knowing the shrapnel radius would cover the ditch. Connor repeated the order, and the shells landed with a force that lifted him off the ground. One shell hit the front hull of the Tiger, shattering the driver's vision port and blinding him. The tank swerved in a panic and crashed into a deep crater, stuck fast in the frozen mud. Only one Tiger remained, and the German infantry was regrouping under the cover of the smoke. Connor could hear their voices and the metallic click of their rifles inside the white cloud. He adjusted his fire based on sound alone, shifting the barrage left and right as he heard movement. The artillery battery reported they were running dangerously low on ammunition for the mission. They had only 15 minutes of fire left before they would be forced to stop and reload. Connor had been in that freezing ditch for over an hour and 20 minutes of pure hell. His assistant, a private from the intelligence section, had managed to crawl out to join him. The private brought extra wire and a backup handset, lying 5 feet to Connor's right. He watched for infantry through the smoke while Connor continued to direct the heavy guns. The private spotted movement at 15 yards. Germans were coming through the white haze. Connor called the coordinates, and the shells landed only 12 yards from their ditch. The concussion wave slammed both men into the frozen earth, and the private began to scream. Shrapnel had torn through his leg, and blood was staining the white snow a deep, dark red. Connor pulled the wounded man deeper into the shallow ditch, trying to shield him from the fire. The private refused to be evacuated, staying in the mud to keep watch for the enemy. The last Tiger was 60 yards from the line, and German soldiers were 10 yards from Connor. He dropped the artillery 5 yards in front of his ditch, the closest fire of the day. The blast slammed Connor's body into the earth and left his ears ringing with a deafening silence. But the Germans, who had been 10 yards away, were gone, erased by the American shells. He cranked the handset with shaking hands, his body nearing the point of total exhaustion. The officer's voice on the line sounded faint, as if he were speaking from another planet. Connor adjusted the fire onto the last Tiger, which was now 40 yards from the foxholes. Its turret was turning, searching for a final target to destroy at point-blank range. Connor requested a maximum concentration of high explosives from every gun in the battery. 12 shells arrived at once, and the Tiger disappeared in a spectacular storm of fire. When the smoke cleared, the tank was still there, but it was no longer a threat to the line. The optics were shattered, and the crew abandoned the blind monster to run for the woods. American rifles from the foxholes cut 3 of them down as they fled through the snow. All 6 Tigers were now destroyed or abandoned, and the armored threat had been broken. The German infantry was still scattered across the field, but they had taken massive losses. At least 150 were dead or wounded, but 400 veterans were still capable of a final push. Connor shifted the barrage back to the tree line to ensure the retreat remained permanent. He walked the shells across every crater and every thicket where a German might be hiding. The battalion commander ordered Connor to withdraw and fall back to the safety of the line. But Connor stayed in the ditch, knowing that if he left, the artillery would be firing blind. He watched for any sign of a German rally, his hands numb and his shoulder throbbing with pain. The wounded private stayed beside him, his rifle aimed at the smoke-filled tree line ahead. 2 hours had passed since Connor had first walked out of the command post into the fire. The German artillery tried one last time to kill him, walking their shells toward his ditch. Connor called for counter-battery fire, giving the coordinates of the German guns in the rear. The American howitzers shifted targets and silenced the German batteries within minutes. The counterattack was over. The Germans were dragging their wounded back into the deep woods. Connor stayed for another 20 minutes to ensure that no second wave was coming. The battlefield finally grew quiet, the only sound being the wind and the cries of the dying. He finally stood up, his legs locking and his joints refusing to bend after the cold. He supported the wounded private, and they began the long walk back to the American lines. Soldiers emerged from their foxholes and stared at the cratered moonscape Connor had created. The battalion commander met him at the line and nodded, unable to find words for what he saw. Medics took the private away, and Connor walked back to the command post to finish his work. A medic removed a piece of shrapnel from Connor's shoulder and told him how lucky he was.
Ow!
The intelligence section counted 53 dead Germans and 6 destroyed Tiger tanks. The 3rd Battalion had lost 11 men, but the line had held against impossible odds. The Germans never attacked that sector again. They had been broken by the fire from the ditch. In February 1945, Lieutenant General Alexander Patch presented Connor with the Distinguished Service Cross. He was sent home shortly after. Having served 28 consecutive months in combat, he arrived in New York and was honorably discharged, returning to the quiet life of a farmer. He married Pauline and never spoke of the war, keeping his medals in a hidden cardboard box. 53 years later, a researcher discovered Connor's citations and was moved to tears. He realized that Connor had performed actions that far exceeded the requirements of his medals. A long battle began to upgrade his Distinguished Service Cross to the Medal of Honor. Connor died in 1998, but Pauline continued the fight for her husband's rightful legacy. She sued the government and gathered every witness she could find from that day in 1945. The case eventually reached a mediation where the government attorney realized Connor had saved her father. In 2018, the upgrade was finally approved by Congress and the President of the United States. Pauline, at 9 years old, traveled to the White House to receive the nation's highest honor. Garland Merle Connor was the second most decorated soldier of the entire Second World War. Yet, he lived his life in total humility, never seeking fame or recognition for his courage. He was a man who saw what needed to be done and didn't hesitate to walk into the fire. His story is a reminder that the greatest heroes are often the quietest men among us. We must never forget the small farmer from Kentucky who called down the thunder in France. Please like and subscribe to help us keep these forgotten memories alive for the next generation. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from and if you have a hero in your family. Thank you for watching the story of First Lieutenant Garland Merle Connor, a true American legend.